Despite the horrific blizzard that had just passed, Peter and his dog Ghost were determined to venture into the dangerous Wolf Peak area. The night before, a mysterious streak of fire had torn across the sky, followed by an explosion that shook the entire valley. Ghost, with a strange insistence, led Peter climbing through 4-foot snowdrifts. After hours, the dog stopped, scenting the air and barking. Peter ran over, and the strong smell of jet fuel hit him. This was no civilian aircraft. What he saw was the wreckage of a strange, black machine, made of a composite material he had never seen. And then Ghost barked again. The dog had found an unconscious man, dressed in an unusual flight suit, barely alive in the snow. Please support us by subscribing to our channel. The high-altitude wind was a restless thing, a constant pressure against the logs of the cabin. It was the only sound Peter trusted. It never changed, and it never lied. Inside, the silence was broken only by the crackle of the wood stove and the rhythmic, soft breathing of the dog, asleep at his feet. This was their life, Peter and Ghost. Peter was a man carved from the same hard, lonely timber as the mountains around him. At 46, he was tall and lean, a wiry strength left over from his years in the army. His brown hair was cut short, surrendering to a distinguished silver at the temples, and his face, mostly hidden behind a thick but tidy beard, was rugged but held a deep, quiet kindness in the eyes. He wore the uniform of the Bitterroot Valley in winter, a thick flannel shirt, worn denim, and heavy wool socks. He was sitting in his worn armchair, a book open on his lap, but he had not turned a page in an hour. His gaze was fixed on the cabin's large window, which now reflected only the warm light of the room. Outside, the world had vanished. A snowstorm, the first real monster of the season, had descended on North Star 3 days ago. The small, isolated Montana town was now completely cut off. The plows would not even try to clear the mountain pass for at least another 2 days. The phone line was dead, a high-pitched whine its only reply. The internet, reliant on a satellite dish buried under 2 feet of snow, was a distant memory. Peter did not mind the isolation. He had sought it out. He had come here to the very edge of the wilderness to escape a world that moved too fast and spoke too loud. He had also come here to heal, though he knew some wounds never truly closed. They just scarred over, tight and pulling. He felt the familiar pull now. It started with the silence of the snow. It reminded him of the silence before. The ticking of the mantel clock grew louder, each click a hammer blow against his calm. The walls of the small cabin seemed to shrink, the warm air growing thick and heavy. He could smell the dust, the ozone. His vision narrowed. Before the panic could take root, a cold, wet nose pressed firmly into his palm. Peter blinked. He looked down. Ghost was no longer sleeping. The 5-year-old German Shepherd was standing, his head resting on Peter's knee, looking up with an unnerving, intelligent gaze. Ghost was a magnificent animal. His coat was not the standard black and tan, but a rare and beautiful silver gray that blended with the white fur on his chest and legs, making him almost invisible in the snow. He was a rescue, found half-starved near the Canadian border, but he carried himself with the quiet dignity of a wolf. He was calm, intuitive, and Peter's anchor to the real world. The dog let out a low, soft whine, not of distress, but of inquiry. He pressed his head harder against Peter's hand, demanding attention, pulling him back from the edge. Peter let out the breath he had been holding. The tightness in his chest eased. The ticking clock faded back into the background. "Hey, boy," Peter whispered, his voice rough from disuse. He scratched the dog behind the ears. "You're right. Just the wind. Just the snow." Ghost, satisfied that Peter was present again, released a soft sigh and lay back down, resting his heavy chin on Peter's boot. The bond was intact. The moment had passed. Peter closed his book. He stood, stretching his stiff legs, and walked to the window. He wiped the condensation from the cold glass. "Just a white wall, Ghost," he said. The snow was still falling, thick and relentless. "Looks like it's just us for a while." He was halfway to the kitchen to make coffee when Ghost's head snapped up. The dog's ears flattened. A low, deep growl rumbled in his chest, a sound Peter had heard only twice before. It was not a warning bark for a deer or a bear. It was an alert. "What is it?" Peter said, freezing. Ghost moved past him, low to the ground, and stood stiff-legged at the cabin door, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. Then Peter heard it. It was not the wind. It was a new sound, a high-pitched, unnatural scream that seemed to tear through the fabric of the storm. It was getting louder, closer. Ghost began to bark, a frantic, desperate sound. "Outside, boy!" Peter grabbed his heavy leather coat from the peg, shoving his bare feet into his boots. He trusted the dog's instincts more than his own. He threw open the cabin door just as the sound peaked. The cold hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath. "What in the—" Peter looked up, shielding his eyes against the driving snow. The clouds tore open. For one terrifying second, a tear of orange light ripped across the night sky. It was low, far too low. It was not a meteor. It was angled wrong, trailing black smoke and shedding sparks. It was silent for a beat, moving faster than any sound. It disappeared over the jagged silhouette of Wolf Peak, the mountain that loomed over the valley. Peter and Ghost stood frozen on the porch, the snow swirling around their legs. 5 seconds later, the sound hit them. It was not an explosion. It was a deep, shuddering boom that seemed to come from the earth itself. The windows of the cabin rattled in their frames. A cascade of snow slid from the roof, dumping onto the porch with a heavy whoosh. Then, silence. Only the wind remained. Ghost stopped barking, letting out a confused whine, looking up at Peter for an explanation. Peter had none. He stared into the darkness, his heart hammering against his ribs for a reason entirely separate from his past. His mind, trained by years of service, was already calculating the trajectory, the speed, the sound. "That wasn't lightning," Peter said to the storm. "That was a crash." He stood there for a long time, the cold seeping into his bones, before he finally called Ghost back inside and shut the door. Sleep was impossible. The rest of the night was spent pacing, drinking coffee, and staring at the flames in the stove. The sun rose late, a weak gray smear in the east. The storm had finally broken, leaving behind a world of pristine, deadly white. The snow was piled in massive drifts, 4 feet deep in places. Peter stood at the window, Ghost at his side, looking at Wolf Peak. It was at least a 3-hour hike in good weather. In this, it would be twice that. It was dangerous. The avalanche risk would be high. The logical thing to do was to stay put, to wait for the plows, to wait for someone else. But Peter knew he would not. He was the only one who lived this deep in the valley. He was the only one who had seen it. If someone was out there, hurt, they would not survive another night. "I guess we have to go look, boy," Peter said, his voice resigned. Ghost wagged his tail once, as if he had already known. An hour later, they were ready. Peter was dressed in full winter gear, snowshoes strapped to his feet. He carried a heavy pack with a thermos of hot broth, medical supplies, flares, and climbing rope. Ghost, his thick fur providing all the insulation he needed, bounded ahead, his powerful legs plunging through the powder. The hike was brutal. The silence of the forest was absolute, broken only by Peter's labored breathing and the crunch of his snowshoes. Ghost was their guide, his nose to the snow, instinctively picking the safest path. They climbed for hours, winding their way up the side of the mountain. Peter's lungs burned, but his focus was absolute. This was a mission. This he understood. It was Ghost who found it first. He stopped, his head high, sniffing the air. He let out a sharp bark and bounded off the trail, disappearing into a grove of thick pines. "Ghost!" "Wait," Peter called, pushing after him. When he broke through the trees, he smelled it, the acrid, chemical smell of jet fuel, sharp and wrong in the clean mountain air. The crash site was a scar of violence. A small, sleek aircraft, unlike anything Peter had ever seen, was smashed into the mountainside. It was not aluminum. The wreckage was made of some dark, matte black composite material that had shattered like glass. There were no civilian markings, no tail numbers he could recognize. "My God," Peter breathed. Ghost was sniffing frantically at a large snowdrift 20 yards from the main wreckage. He started digging, whining, throwing plumes of snow behind him. Peter ran, his snowshoes sinking. "What is it, boy? What did you find?" He saw the boot first, black, tactical. Peter dropped to his knees and dug with his gloved hands. He uncovered a leg, an arm, and then the torso of a man, dressed in a dark flight suit, half buried in the snow, his face turned away. Peter's training took over. He felt for a pulse in the man's neck. It was there. Faint, thready, but it was there. He was alive. Peter quickly cleared the snow from the man's face. He was young, perhaps 30, with sharp features and dark hair plastered to his forehead. Peter quickly checked for immediate trauma, his hands running over the man's limbs. A severe break in the left leg, possible internal injuries, but no arterial bleeding. He was hypothermic. They had to move, fast. "We got to get him out of here, Ghost." As Peter prepared to carefully move the stranger, he checked the man's pockets for identification, anything that could tell him who this was. He found a thin, waterproof wallet. Inside there was an identification card with a language Peter did not recognize, but the name was clear, in Roman characters. Luca. The man, Luca, groaned, a sound of deep, agonizing pain, as Peter gently tried to shift him. "It's okay," Peter said, his voice calm and steady, the way he spoke to Ghost during a thunderstorm. "It's okay. I've got you. We're going to get you home." Ghost pressed close, licking the stranger's pale hand, as if offering his own warmth, his own assurance, in the vast, cold silence of the mountain. The journey back was a controlled nightmare. Luca was a dead weight, unconscious and bleeding. Peter, running on adrenaline and a grim familiarity with trauma, had fashioned a makeshift travois from pine branches and his own climbing rope, dragging the wounded man down the treacherous, snow-choked slope. Ghost scouted ahead, a silent gray shadow, picking the path of least resistance, his head constantly swiveling, alert to the dangers of the fresh snowpack. By the time Peter hauled the pilot onto the porch of his cabin, his lungs were burning, and his own old scars ached in protest. He settled Luca onto the sturdy cot he kept by the fireplace, his movements economical and practiced. He cut away the strange, rubbery flight suit, his military first aid training surging to the forefront. The man's left leg was a mess, a clear, compound fracture. There was a deep laceration on his scalp that was still weeping blood, and his breathing was shallow. "All right, Luca, let's see what we can do for you," Peter murmured, more to himself than to the unconscious man. He worked quickly, cleaning the head wound, applying pressure. He fetched his own medical kit, a comprehensive bag he kept for emergencies. As he was laying out butterfly closures, he heard Ghost's low woof from the door. A moment later, a sharp rapping echoed. "Peter! Open up! I saw the smoke!" A wave of relief washed over Peter. He unbarred the door. The woman who pushed inside was a whirlwind of snow and practical energy. This was Ivis, the town's only nurse and Peter's closest, perhaps only, friend. She was in her mid-40s, with intelligent green eyes that had seen too much, and a braid of auburn hair that was already escaping its confines. She was the one person in North Star who understood the silence he required. "Pete, what did you get into now?" she began, shaking snow from her parka. Her eyes landed on the man on the cot, and her tone shifted instantly from friendly exasperation to sharp professionalism. "Dear Lord!" She was at Luca's side in a second, pulling on sterile gloves from her own bag. "How long ago?" "Found him at the peak, an hour, maybe 2, after sunrise. Crash happened last night," Peter reported, falling into the familiar rhythm of an assistant. "Vitals are weak. He's in shock. Deep hypothermia." Ivis assessed, her fingers on Luca's throat. "This leg is bad, but it's the internal bleeding I'm worried about. He's bleeding somewhere we can't see." Her eyes met Peter's. "He's in a very bad way. We can't move him, not with the pass closed." "So we stabilize him here," Peter stated. It was not a question. "We try." For the next hour, they worked in tandem, a practiced team. Ivis set the leg as best she could, creating a rigid splint. Peter held the man steady, murmuring reassurances that were meant more for himself than the patient. Ghost lay by the fire, his head on his paws, watching every move with intense, quiet observation. As Ivis was finishing a bandage, the man's eyelids fluttered. He groaned, a sound of pure agony, and his eyes opened. They were dark and wide with terror. He tried to sit up, hissing in a language Peter did not recognize. "Easy, easy," Peter said, placing a firm, gentle hand on his shoulder. "You're safe. You're in a cabin. You were in a crash." The man, Luca, stared at him, his gaze darting from Peter to Ivis and then to Ghost, who had risen to his feet. Where am?" His voice was a raw whisper, his English heavily accented, the words broken. "Montana, the Bitterroot Mountains," Peter said slowly. "You're safe." "Plane," Luca gasped, wincing. "The snow, the storm." He seemed to gather himself, his eyes focusing. "I am photographer, wildlife. The engine, it is gone. The storm, it was too strong." Peter and Ivis exchanged a look. A wildlife photographer, flying a plane that looked like a military prototype in the worst storm of the decade. The story was as thin as the ice on the creek. Before either of them could respond, Ghost let out a low growl, his attention fixed on the door. A heavy, authoritative knock followed. Peter's shoulders tensed. He glanced at Ivis, who gave a small, worried shake of her head. He went to the door and opened it. The man standing on the porch was tall and broad, filling the frame. He wore a heavy wool coat that failed to hide his imposing nature. This was Barnes, the former sheriff of North Star. He was a man in his late 60s, with a face like carved granite and eyes the color of a frozen lake. He had retired 5 years prior, but he had never relinquished his air of absolute authority. "Peter," Barnes said, his voice a low rumble. He did not ask to come in. He simply stepped past Peter, his gaze immediately landing on Luca. "Heard there was a commotion." Someone in town saw the smoke plume from the peak. Ivis stepped forward, wiping her hands on a cloth. "He's a crash survivor, Barnes." "Name's Luca. He's a photographer. His plane went down in the storm." Barnes grunted, his eyes assessing the pilot with deep, unconcealed suspicion. He looked at the splint, the bandages, and then at Peter. "A photographer? Is that right? Flying in a blizzard? Must have been desperate for a picture." "He's severely injured," Ivis said, her voice firm. "He needs rest, not an interrogation." "He's in my town, Ivis. That makes him my business," Barnes retorted. He walked over to the fragments of the flight suit Peter had cut away and left by the door. He picked one up, rubbing the strange composite fabric between his thumb and forefinger. "I'm going up to the crash site," Barnes announced, his eyes locking on Peter. "See what kind of camera this photographer was using." "The snow's too deep. It's not safe," Peter said. "It wasn't too deep for you," Barnes countered. "I'll be back." He turned and left, the cabin door closing with a heavy, final sound. "That man is a bully," Ivis said quietly, her brow furrowed. "He's suspicious," Peter said, "and he's not wrong to be." He looked at Luca, who had closed his eyes again, his face pale and slick with sweat. 2 hours later, Barnes returned. The snow on his coat told Peter he had made the trip. "Well," Barnes said, standing in the center of the room, dripping melting snow onto the wooden floor, "I've seen it. And I can tell you one thing." He pointed a thick finger at the resting pilot. "That man is no photographer." "Barnes," Ivis started. "Don't Barnes me, Ivis. The plane is made of some kind of black metal I've never seen, shattered like obsidian. There are symbols on the tail fin that don't belong to any airline I know. It's advanced. Military." He looked at Peter. "You're a soldier. You saw it. You know I'm right." Peter did not, could not answer. "You're harboring him, Peter," Barnes said, his voice dangerously low. "Whatever he is, he's trouble, and you brought it to your door." Barnes left without another word, leaving a heavy silence in his wake. Later that evening, as dusk painted the snow blue, Ivis prepared to leave. "I'll be back in the morning," she said, packing her bag. "Keep him warm. Try to get some broth into him if he wakes." She paused at the door, touching Peter's arm. "Be careful, Pete. Barnes speaks for a lot of the fear in this town." After she left, Peter was alone with the sleeping pilot and the dog. Barnes's words echoed in his head. "You know I'm right." He did. The feeling had been nagging him, a cold knot in his stomach, a soldier's instinct. He looked at Ghost, who was watching him, always watching. "I have to go back," Peter said. "Just one more look. Something doesn't add up." He grabbed his coat. The air was frigid, the stars sharp and cold overhead. He and Ghost moved quickly, their steps silent in the deep powder. The crash site was eerie in the moonlight, a black wound in the white snow. Peter went straight to the cockpit, searching again. Nothing. Ghost, however, was not with him. The dog was 20 yards away, at the very spot where he had first found Luca. He was digging, his paws moving in a blur, whining with a low, focused intensity. "What is it, boy?" Peter moved toward him, his heart suddenly quickening. "What did you find?" Ghost was digging at the base of a snowdrift, near where Luca had been thrown. Peter got on his knees, pushing the snow away with his hands. His gloves hit something hard. It was not a rock. It was metal. He cleared the snow away, his breath fogging in the air. It was a case. A small, dark gray metal briefcase, reinforced at the corners. It looked like it could survive a direct blast. There were no markings, just a complex, high-security locking keypad on its face. Peter pulled it free. It was heavy. This was what Barnes had missed. This was what the pilot had been carrying. This was what the strange, advanced plane was for. His soldier's instinct, the one that had kept him alive for years, screamed at him. This was not just trouble. This was the reason for the crash. His first thought was to call Barnes. His second, faster and colder, was number. Barnes was fear. Barnes was authority. Peter did not trust authority. He needed to know what this was. He needed to understand the truth before the fear took over. He tucked the small, heavy case under his parka against his chest. It was cold as ice. "Let's go home, Ghost," Peter whispered, his voice tight. "We saw nothing. You understand me? We saw nothing." Ghost looked up at him, the case, and then back at the trail home. He let out a soft, single woof of understanding. Back in the cabin, Luca was still asleep, his breathing shallow. Peter walked past him, through the small kitchen, and into the attached woodshed. It was cold, smelling of pine and oil. He went to the far wall, pulled aside a stack of split logs, and knelt. He worked his fingers under a floorboard he had cut himself years ago, a place for things he did not want found. He placed the metal case into the dark, hidden space. He replaced the board, the sound barely audible. He kicked some sawdust over the seam and then restacked the wood. It was gone. The secret was kept. The following morning, the world outside was bright and dead. The storm had passed, leaving a sky of aching, cloudless blue. But the temperature had plummeted. The snow, which had been heavy and wet, was now a fine, glittering powder. The isolation was no longer just about the snowdrifts. It was about the cold. Luca's condition had worsened. The leg was angry and inflamed. But it was the fever that worried Ivis. She had returned at dawn, her face etched with concern. "He's septic, Peter," she said, wringing out a cloth and a bowl of snowmelt. She placed the cold, damp rag on Luca's forehead. He was delirious, muttering, his head tossing on the pillow. "His breathing is too shallow. This isn't just the crash. He has an infection." She looked at Peter, her green eyes filled with a frustrating helplessness. "We need to get him to a hospital." "But I tried the town's emergency satellite phone at the clinic. It's dead. The whole town's communication grid is down." The cold must have frozen the main hub. Peter nodded, his face grim. He looked at the silent satellite phone on his own wall. "Mine's dead, too. Tried it all night. I can't call for a life flight." "I can't even get advice from a doctor," Ivis said, her voice tight. "There's only one person in this whole valley who might be able to fix it." Peter looked up, his expression guarded. He distrusted bringing any more of the town's drama to his door. "Who?" "Milo," Ivis said. "Milo Kucharik, the kid who manages the motel with his parents. He's the only real electronics engineer we have. If it's a hardware problem, He's our only shot." Peter did not like it. He had seen the kid around town, quiet and keeping to himself. But he looked at Luca, who was now shivering violently despite the blankets and the roaring fire. He gave a curt, reluctant nod. Ivis went to her truck and used her short-range radio, the one that could just barely reach the town center. An hour later, a small, rattling utility truck pulled up the long, snowy drive. Ghost, who had been sleeping by the fire, rose to his feet, his ears pricked. He did not growl, but he stood as a silent, gray sentinel at Peter's side. Peter opened the door. The young man standing on the porch was slight, almost bird-like, swimming in a high-tech parka that looked absurdly out of place against the rustic logs of the cabin. This was Milo. He was perhaps 25, with a thin face, a shock of unruly dark hair, and intelligent, perpetually nervous eyes behind thick-rimmed glasses. He was the son of the Czech immigrants who ran the North Star Motel, a quiet boy who had gone away to college for engineering and then returned, much to the town's confusion, to this remote, low-tech valley. He clutched a heavy, specialized toolkit to his chest. "Ivis," she called, Milo said, his voice quiet, his eyes darting from Peter to the large dog. "Said the town hub is down? And your satellite phone?" "Get in," Peter said. Milo stepped inside, his boots hesitant on the wooden floor. He immediately spotted Luca on the cot. His eyes widened, but he said nothing, just quickly looked away. "The dog?" Milo asked, staying near the door. "He's fine," Peter said, his tone offering no further reassurance. "The phone's on the wall." Ghost did not take his eyes off the new arrival. He remained standing, watchful. Milo nodded, shedding his parka. He was all nervous energy, his hands quick and precise as he opened his kit. He went to the satellite terminal, unscrewed the panel, and attached a small diagnostic tablet. "It's not the phone," Milo murmured, mostly to himself. "The panel is getting power. The problem is the dish, the receiver on the roof. It's not connecting. It's either frozen solid or the alignment is completely off." "Can you fix it?" Peter asked, his voice a low rumble. He stood with his arms crossed, a few feet away, making no pretense of giving the man space. "Maybe. I need to check the main cabling junction. See if the storm sheared it," Milo said, his focus entirely on the wires. As Milo worked, Ivis was tending to Luca. The pilot was lost in the fever, his body rigid with pain. He was muttering again, the words slurred but insistent. "Voda, molim vas," he rasped. "Zima, takva zima." Peter just heard the sounds, the desperate, universal language of pain. Milo, however, froze. His hand, which had been deftly tracing a wire, stopped. The small screwdriver he was holding slipped from his fingers and clattered onto the floor. The sound was shockingly loud in the quiet cabin. Peter's gaze snapped to Milo. The young man was pale, his mouth slightly open. He was staring at Luca, his expression one of profound, disbelieving shock. "What is it?" Peter demanded, his voice sharp. "Nothing," Milo said, bending quickly to retrieve his tool. His hands were shaking. "He just startled me." Luca groaned again, his eyes squeezed shut. "Onisu, onilaju, pomozi mi." Milo looked as if he had been struck. He glanced frantically at Peter and Ivis, who were watching him. He needed to get them out of the room. He turned to Peter, his professional demeanor a thin mask over his sudden panic. The junction box. It's outside, on the north wall, by the generator. It's probably buried in a drift. I need you to clear the snow away from it. All of it. I have to check the grounding wire, or I could fry the whole system." It was a plausible, technical-sounding request, Peter, desperate to get the line working, gave a curt nod. "Evis, can you get me a fresh bowl of snow? This water's warm," he said, handing her the bowl. Evis nodded and followed Peter to the door. "Ghost," Peter commanded. "Watch." The dog did not move from his spot, his silver-gray eyes fixed intently on Milo. The moment the heavy cabin door thudded shut, Milo was at the cot. He dropped to his knees, his face inches from Luca's. He whispered, the words tumbling out in the same clipped Eastern European tongue. "Tisi Odnashi." Luca's eyes fluttered open. The delirium was still there, but a spark of desperate, lucid recognition cut through it. He saw Milo, and his hand shot out, grabbing the front of Milo's jacket with a desperate, weak grip. "Da, pomozi mi." "Who are you?" Milo whispered, his voice trembling. "What was that plane?" "Oni laju," Luca rasped, his eyes wild. "They lie. They say, spy. I am not. I am engineer, like you. They shot me down." "Who? Who shot you?" Milo looked terrified, trapped between the dying man and the locked door. "My own colleagues. I found what they are doing. The test, it is a crime. I took the proof." Luca's breath hitched. "They will kill me for it. They must not find the case. Molim vas, please." Milo felt the blood drain from his face. A crime? A case? This was not a lost photographer. This was something vast and dangerous. Why me?" Milo asked, his voice cracking. Luca's gaze softened for a second, a flicker of shared understanding passing between them. "They look at you. How?" Milo froze. He knew exactly what Luca meant. He thought of Barnes, of the way the loggers at the diner looked through him, the quiet, dismissive air he had breathed his entire life in this town. He was the motel kid, the foreigner, the smart boy who didn't belong. He was useful, like a tool, but he was not one of them. Luca was a stranger, a possible enemy. But in that moment, he was the only person in the valley who saw Milo for exactly who he was. They were the same, isolated. "Please," Luca whispered again, his grip failing. The sound of heavy boots crunching on the porch broke the spell. Milo leaped back to the terminal just as the door opened, letting in a swirl of icy air. Peter and Ivis entered. "It's clear," Peter said, brushing snow from his coat. He looked at Milo, then at Ghost. The dog had not moved, but a low, almost inaudible rumble was vibrating in his chest. Milo kept his back to them, gathering his tools with shaking hands. It's no good," he said, his voice strained. Peter's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean?" "The dish itself, the main receiver. The storm must have fried the circuitry, or a piece of ice shattered the lens. It's dead, Mr. Peter. I can't fix it. It needs to be completely replaced. I'm sorry." Peter looked at him, his gaze flat and cold. He looked at Ghost, who was still emitting that low, warning hum. Peter knew, with the same certainty he felt in his bones before an ambush, that Milo was lying. "Right," Peter said. "Thanks for trying." Milo grabbed his parka and his toolkit, almost running to the door. He fumbled with the latch. I'll tell Ivis if the town hub gets fixed," he stammered, not looking at anyone. He slipped out the door, and a moment later the sound of his truck's engine straining against the snow filled the air. He drove away, leaving Peter and Ivis in the heavy silence, now thick with a new, unspoken secret. Milo, for his part, made it 2 miles down the road before he pulled over, his truck idling in the vast white emptiness. He slammed his hands against the steering wheel. He was terrified. He was a simple engineer. He was not a spy. He was not a soldier. But he was also a man who had been invisible his entire life. Luca's words echoed in his head. They lie. He was torn between a deep, instinctive loyalty to the only other man who shared his blood and his language, and a primal fear of the American authorities who held his entire family's fragile life in their hands. He decided, his hands shaking, that he had seen nothing, heard nothing. He would do nothing. For now, Luca was just a patient, a man dying in a stranger's cabin. Milo put the truck in gear and drove toward the false safety of the town. The cabin had become a place of waiting for the fever to break, waiting for the plows, and now, for Peter, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Milo's lie hung in the air, as cold and clear as the atmosphere outside. Peter knew the young engineer had not told the truth about the satellite phone, and that knowledge coiled in his gut. Luca remained delirious, a vessel of pain and infection. Ivis was a constant, stressed presence, rotating cold compresses and checking the pilot's weak pulse. The antibiotics she had were broad spectrum, but they were barely holding the line. "He needs a hospital, Peter," she said on the third morning, her voice flat with exhaustion. "Whatever is inside him is winning. He can't fight it off here." As if summoned by the air of desperation, the sound of Milo's rattling truck returned. Before the engine even cut off, Ghost was on his feet. The silver-gray fur on his shoulders rose, not in aggression, but in a display of profound, controlled alertness. He let out a single, low huff. It was not a growl. It was a notification. The threat has returned. Peter put his hand on the dog's head, feeling the tension in the animal's muscles. "I know, boy." Milo knocked, a quick, nervous tapping. Peter opened the door. Milo looked even more haggard than Ivis. Dark circles, born of fear and sleeplessness, were stark under his eyes. "Ivis, Peter," he stammered, holding up a small, complex-looking tool. "I've been thinking. I've been reading the schematics for your system. There might be a hard-wired bypass. I might be able to boost the signal just using the local antenna, but I have to check the internal wiring again. It's a long shot." It was a good lie, plausible, technical, and steeped in the language of help. "Come in," Peter said, his voice flat. Milo stepped inside, trying to appear professional, but his eyes immediately flickered to Luca. He set his toolkit on the floor by the wall terminal near the cot. Ghosts did not move from Peter's side, but his entire body was a rigid line of focus. His gaze tracked Milo's every move. "Peter, can you help me?" Ivis called from the small kitchen. "I need to boil more snow for the compresses. This bucket is too heavy for me." Peter looked at Ghost, then at Milo, who was already pretending to be absorbed by the wiring. "Ghost, stay," he commanded. The moment Peter disappeared into the kitchen, Milo moved. He knelt by the cot, his back to the dog, his hands fumbling with the wall plate. "Nemogu," Milo whispered in their shared tongue, his voice frantic. "The phone," I lied. "I cannot fix it. They don't trust me." Luca's eyes fluttered open, a single moment of clarity in the feverish haze. He recognized his countryman. "Kofer," Luca rasped. "The case. Onaj Vojnik." The soldier.
Olga ima. Video sam. He has it. I saw him.
"Gdzie?" Milo whispered.
Where?
Luca's eyes started to roll back, the fever reclaiming him. "Radionica. The workshop." Before Luca could say another word, Milo felt a presence. A low, thoracic rumble, more felt than heard, vibrated the floorboards. Milo froze. He slowly turned his head. Ghost was no longer by the fire. He was standing directly behind Milo, not 2 feet away. He was not growling, not showing his teeth. He was simply there. His silver-gray eyes were locked on Milo, with an intelligence that was far colder and more unnerving than any simple animal anger. He was telling Milo, without a sound, that he had heard, that he knew. Milo scrambled back, his hands up, as if warding off a wolf. "Nice dog. Good dog." Ghost did not move, did not blink. He just held his ground. Peter came back into the room, holding the heavy pot. He took in the scene at a glance. Milo pale and pressed against the wall. Ghost standing guard over the cot. "Everything all right?" Peter asked, his voice deceptively calm. "Yes, fine, just checking the wires," Milo said, his voice cracking. He gestured at the wall. "It's no good. This isn't going to work." Peter's gaze went from Milo to Ghost. The dog had not backed down. He was now standing between Milo and the cot, a clear, living barrier. Peter had known this dog for 3 years. He had seen him gentle with Ivis, playful with deer, and lethally silent with a cornered coyote. He had never seen this cold, calculated containment of a human. His trust, which he gave out sparingly, was absolute in this dog. The dog was never wrong. Milo, seeing he could get no closer to Luca, gathered his tools. He was visibly trembling. He had to try another way. He had to get the case. It was the only leverage he had, the only way to save Luca, the only way to save himself. He came back the next day. This time, Peter met him on the porch. Ghost was at his side, standing in the open doorway, a silent shadow. "What do you want, Milo?" Peter asked. The cold air fogged his words. I know what's wrong," Milo said, forcing a tone of helpfulness. "The town's hub is down because the main transmitter is frozen. But I've been thinking about the plane." Peter's face remained impassive. "Go on." "The plane," Milo said, gesturing toward the peak. "It's high-tech. It would have a flight data recorder, a black box. These things, they have their own power sources, their own communication protocols. If I can get the black box, I can use its transmitter to bypass the town system. I can send a signal for help. For Luca." Peter stared at him. The silence stretched, broken only by the wind in the pines. "A black box," Peter repeated. "Yes," Milo said, nodding eagerly, sensing a breakthrough. "It would be a small case, probably reinforced, built to survive a crash. Heavy. It would have been thrown clear. Have you seen anything like that?" Milo was describing the very case hidden under the floorboards of the woodshed, the case Luca had just confirmed the existence of, the case Milo could not possibly know about unless he and Luca had communicated. The lie was now complete, and it was fatal. Ghost, who had been standing at Peter's heel, took 2 slow, deliberate steps forward. He moved past Peter and stood in the center of the porch, halfway between Peter and Milo. He turned his body sideways, presenting a full, broad-shouldered profile. He did not look at the woodshed, he looked directly at Milo. Peter followed his dog's logic. Ghost was not just guarding the house, he was guarding the secret. The dog had confirmed everything Peter suspected. Peter's decision was instantaneous. He trusted the animal that had pulled him from his own nightmares. He did not trust the man who was building a new one. "No," Peter said, his voice quiet, but with the finality of a locked door. "I haven't seen anything like that." Milo's face fell. "But, Peter, this could save his life. It's the only way." "I haven't seen it," Peter said again, his voice harder. "I think you should go home, Milo. Don't come back. We'll wait for the plows." Milo looked from Peter's cold, resolved face to the unmoving silver-gray dog. He saw a man and an animal united in a single unbreachable front. He knew he was defeated. He nodded once, a jerky, angry motion, and turned back to his truck, his mind racing. Peter watched him go, then shut the heavy door. He looked down at Ghost, who was now relaxed, his task complete. "Good boy," Peter murmured, scratching the dog's ruff. "Good boy. You told me." At that exact same moment, 15 miles away, Barnes was parked at Parker's Ridge, the highest drivable point in the county. The wind rocked his heavy-duty truck, but he ignored it. He was aiming a portable satellite data link, his thick fingers clumsy on the frozen keypad. Come on, you billion-dollar piece of junk," he muttered. The status light on the device turned from red to a solid, welcome green. He had a connection. He quickly plugged in his digital camera. The photos he had taken at the crash site, the close-ups of the shattered black material, the strange angular symbols on the tail fin, began to upload, agonizingly slow. He typed a short message to a name he had not contacted since his retirement, a contact at Fort Harrison. "Need ID on this. Wreckage found Wolf Peak North Star. Survivor claims photographer. I call Bull. Urgent." The progress bar hit 100%. The message was sent. Barnes lowered the antenna, a grim, cold satisfaction on his face. He looked out over the vast white valley. "Now we'll find out," he said to the empty cab. "Now we'll see what kind of pictures you were taking, Mr. Luca." The world thawed, but it did not heal. For 2 days after Milo's last visit, the temperature rose just enough to make the snow heavy and wet, causing branches to snap with the sound of distant gunfire. The risk of an avalanche was now at its peak. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with the metallic smell of fever. Luca was fading. His moments of lucidity were gone, replaced by a constant, unintelligible muttering in his native tongue. His skin was gray, his breathing a shallow rasp. "He's losing, Peter," Ivis said, her voice hollow. She had not left the cabin in over 24 hours. She was sitting by the cot, her hand on Luca's forehead. "The infection is in his blood. If we don't get him to a hospital, he's not going to make it through another night." Peter stood at the window, staring at the impassable wall of snow blocking his drive. He felt the old, familiar weight of helplessness, the kind that came when you were pinned down, unable to act. The plows won't come, not with the avalanche risk. "Then we have to get the phone working," Ivis insisted, her eyes pleading. "Try it again." Peter sighed. He had tried it every hour. He went to the satellite terminal on the wall. He picked up the receiver. Static. He hung it up and hit the reboot switch, just as he had done a dozen times before. Ghost, who had been asleep at Peter's feet, let out a low whine. The small, 20-inch television in the corner of the room, which had been a screen of hissing white noise for 5 days, suddenly flickered. Peter and Ivis both froze. A distorted, snowy image appeared. A local news anchor, his voice garbled, "Worst storm since 1993. Authorities are urging all residents to stay off the roads." "We have a signal," Peter said, his voice tight. He hit the power button on the satellite terminal. The lights blinked from red to a slow, pulsing green. "Ivis, it's working." Ivis scrambled from the cot, relief washing over her face. "Call St. Pat's. Get me the life flight dispatch." Peter was already dialing. The line rang and rang. Then a busy signal. "Everyone in the valley must be trying to call out," Ivis said, her frustration returning. On the television, the local anchor suddenly held up a hand. "One moment. We are being told to go to a national feed. We are interrupting this broadcast for an urgent bulletin from the Department of Homeland Security." The screen cut to black, then to a stark official seal. A serious-faced man in a suit appeared, a National Security Alert banner running below him. Peter put the phone down. "This broadcast is an urgent warning to all citizens in the Mountain West, specifically the states of Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming," the anchor said, his voice grave. "At approximately 0200 hours 5 days ago, an unidentified aircraft of unknown origin penetrated restricted United States airspace." Peter and Ivis stared at the screen. The aircraft failed to respond to military intercepts and was tracked heading northeast, where it is believed to have gone down in the Bitterroot mountain range. Ivis's hand went to her mouth. "Peter, shh." The anchor continued. "The following images, obtained from satellite reconnaissance, are of the confirmed wreckage." An image filled the screen. It was a high-altitude, black-and-white photograph. It was blurry, but the shape was undeniable, a black scar against the white snow. Then a second image, a close-up, clearly taken from a drone or aircraft. Peter felt the blood drain from his face. It was the wreckage on Wolf Peak, the same shattered black composite material, the same angular, alien-looking tail fin with the strange symbols that Barnes had described. "It's him," Ivis whispered, her voice trembling. "It's Luca." "Authorities have confirmed this aircraft was a high-technology surveillance platform," the anchor read, his face grim. "This is an active and serious national security situation." He looked directly into the camera. "The pilot or pilots of this aircraft have not been located. Based on the nature of the mission, these individuals are considered highly trained, armed, and extremely dangerous. Citizens are warned not to approach. If you have seen this aircraft or any suspicious individuals in the Bitterroot area, you are to contact authorities immediately." The screen cut back to the local anchor, who looked visibly shaken. In the cabin, the only sound was the crackling fire and the shallow, rasping breath from the cot. Peter and Ivis looked at each other. Then, as one, they looked at the extremely dangerous man. Luca was shivering violently, his eyes squeezed shut in a fever dream. He looked less like a threat and more like a dying child. Ghost, who had been watching the television with a curious tilt of his head, suddenly stood. He walked to the window, his body rigid, and let out a low, warning growl. "What is it, boy?" Peter asked. his voice rough. But Ivis was staring at him, her eyes wide with a new, dawning horror.
Peter, the case. The one in your woodshed, the one Ghost found. That's what they're looking for, isn't it? Is that why Milo?
Peter had no answer. He was watching his dog. Ghost's growl was deeper now, his gaze fixed on the long, snow-covered drive. At that same moment, in the North Star Grill, the town's only diner, the same broadcast had just finished. The small room, filled with loggers and ranchers drinking their morning coffee, was dead silent. Every eye was on the television mounted in the corner. Barnes sat alone in a booth, his empty coffee mug in his hands. A slow, grim smile of pure vindication spread across his face. He had received the reply from his military contact an hour ago. This broadcast was just the public confirmation.
"Well, I'll be,"
a logger named Hank muttered, his face pale.
"A spy. A damned spy. Here. The panic broke. That's what crashed on the peak. Did you hear that? Dangerous, armed. And he's up there with Peter."
Barnes drained his mug and stood up. His 6'3" frame commanded the room. The ex-sheriff, the man of authority, was back.
"Shut up," he barked.
The room went silent.
"You all heard it," Barnes said, his voice a low, powerful rumble. "They told you. I told you. I knew it from the second I saw that wreckage. And our own Peter, he's harboring him."
"But Peter's a veteran," someone whispered.
"Peter's not right," Hank snapped. "We all know it. Lives up there like a hermit with that wolf dog. He's probably a sympathizer." "He's not a sympathizer," Barnes said, silencing the new rumor. "He's compromised. Or he's a fool, it doesn't matter. What matters is we have an enemy agent on that mountain. The pass is closed. The feds can't get here. It's on us."
He pointed to Hank, then to a quiet rancher named Jim.
"Hank? Jim? You're with me. You know his property. Go home, get your rifles, and get your trucks. We're going up there and we're taking that pilot. We are not letting some foreign spy infect our town." The men didn't hesitate. Fear had turned to anger, and they were looking for a leader. They scrambled from their booths, grabbing their coats. "We have to protect ourselves," Barnes said, his voice ringing with absolute cold certainty. "It's our duty." Back in the cabin, Peter heard it. Ghost had been growling for a full minute, a steady, low rumble. And now Peter heard what the dog had been warning him about, the sound of engines. Not the high-pitched whine of Milo's small truck. These were the deep, throaty roars of heavy-duty diesel engines, multiple V8s, straining and fighting their way up his unplowed drive. Peter moved to the window, pushing aside the curtain. His heart sank. It was not the state police. It was not the plows. It was a convoy. 4 heavy-duty pickup trucks, their plow blades and oversized tires throwing up massive wings of snow, were crawling their way toward his home. He could see the gun rack in the back window of the lead truck. He saw Barnes step out of the lead truck, a heavy hunting rifle in his hand. Peter stepped back from the window, his mind flashing, the walls of the cabin suddenly feeling like a trap. "Peter?" Ivis said, her voice a terrified whisper. "What is that?" Peter looked at Ivis, at the dying man on the cot, and at his dog, who now stood between his master and the door, a silent, silver-gray line of defense. "It's the town," Peter said, his voice flat and dead, all the old battlefield instincts flooding back. "They're here." The cabin door was a thin layer of wood against a wall of anger. Peter stood behind it, Ghost pressed against his leg, the dog's body a solid, tense mass of muscle.
Outside, the diesel engines idled, a low throbbing threat that vibrated through the floor. "Peter!" Barnes's voice boomed, amplified by the cold, thin air. "We know you're in there! Open this door!" Ivis was pale, her hands clenched at her sides. "Don't, Peter." "Don't." "They won't wait, Ivis." He looked at Luca, who was oblivious on the cot, his breathing shallow. He looked at Ghost. "Stay with her," he commanded. Peter unbarred the door and opened it, stepping onto the porch. He held his hands open and empty at his sides, a gesture of non-aggression that felt futile. Barnes stood 3 feet away, his face a mask of cold granite. He held his rifle pointed safely at the ground, but it was a clear symbol of his intent. Behind him, Hank and Jim and 3 other men from the town fanned out, their expressions a mix of fear and righteous anger. "Hand him over, Peter," Barnes said. It was not a request. "I can't do that, Barnes," Peter said, his voice quiet but carrying in the cold. "That wasn't a question," Barnes snapped. "We saw the news. You're harboring a foreign enemy, an armed and dangerous spy." "Look inside, Barnes," Peter said, gesturing with his chin toward the open door. Ghost was visible now, standing in the doorway like a gray shadow, his eyes fixed on Barnes. "He's not a spy. He's a patient. He's septic. He's dying." Ivis stepped forward, her voice shaking but firm. "It's true, Barnes. I'm a nurse. You all know me. He's dying of a massive infection. Moving him will kill him. He's not a threat to anyone." Hank, the big logger, pushed forward. "That's what you say, Ivis. The government says he's dangerous. You'd trust him," he jabbed a gloved finger at Peter, "over a national security bulletin? He's been hiding him for days." "He's a man." Peter's voice rose, the first crack in his composure. "Whatever he is, he's a human being, and he is sick. You can't just take him." "We're taking him to the authorities," Barnes said. "This is out of your hands." As Barnes took a step toward the porch, the sound of a different, higher-pitched engine made them all pause. Milo's small utility truck, rattling and struggling in the deep snow ruts left by the larger pickups, pulled up behind the convoy. Milo got out, his thin frame trembling. He looked at the armed men, at Barnes on the porch, and at Peter. He looked terrified, a rabbit caught between 2 closing traps. Peter saw the fear in Milo's eyes. He saw the same fear in Hank and Jim. This was not justice. This was a panic-fueled mob. "Listen to me," Peter tried again, his voice dropping, trying to reason with them. "This isn't who we are. This is a sick man. He needs help. Your fight isn't with him. It's not with me." "He's right," Hank sneered, his anger looking for a new, easier target. His eyes landed on Milo, who was lingering at the edge of the property, afraid to approach, afraid to leave. "He ain't one of us," Hank roared, swinging his arm to point directly at Milo. "And neither is he! What are you doing here, motel kid?" Milo froze. Every man turned to look at him. "You're all the same," Hank shouted, the words ripping through the air. "You and him! Why don't you go back where you came from?" The words struck Milo harder than a physical blow. He saw his father's face, always smiling, always deferential to the guests. He saw his mother, tirelessly working, trying to erase her accent. He saw himself, the quiet, smart boy who fixed their electronics but was never invited to their bonfires. He saw the years of quiet, polite exclusion, the invisible wall that stood between his family and the real town.
He was, and always would be, the outsider.
Luca's feverish words from the cabin echoed in his mind. They look at you. How? In that second, the fear in Milo's chest turned to a cold, hard stone. They had cornered him. They had just told him, in front of everyone, that he did not belong, that he was the same as the enemy on the cot. If he was already the enemy, he would act like one. His choice was made. It was no longer a choice. It was an inevitability. While all eyes were on the confrontation, Milo's terror found a focus. He knew what he had to do. "Barnes, I'm telling you for the last time," Peter said, stepping in front of the doorway as Barnes moved forward. "You are not coming into my house." "Then we'll move you," Barnes said, raising his hand. The crowd surged. Hank and Jim grabbed Peter's arms. He instinctively tensed, his training kicking in. He ripped his arm free from Hank, pushing him back. "No!" Ivis screamed. Ghost exploded from the doorway, not barking, but with a deep, chest-splitting snarl, his teeth bared. He planted himself in front of Peter, holding the line. The men, who were not afraid of Peter, stumbled back from the dog. This was the moment. No one was watching Milo. All their attention was on the man and the dog at the front door. Milo slipped away, his feet silent in the snow. He moved around the side of the house, his heart hammering. He knew this property. He had been here twice. He knew the layout. He reached the attached woodshed at the back. The door was just latched. He slipped inside, into the cold, dark space that smelled of pine sap and chainsaw oil. He scrambled to the corner, pulling aside the stacked logs Peter had used to hide the spot. His fingers found the loose floorboard. He lifted it. There, in the dark space, was the metal case. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely lift it. It was heavy, dense. He fumbled with his parka, zipping the case inside, the cold metal pressing against his ribs. He had it, but it was not enough. He could not just walk away. He had to create a diversion. He had to get them away from the cabin. He crept back out of the woodshed. The shouting from the front was louder now. Milo moved to the main electrical junction box for the house, mounted on the side wall, near the loud, chugging generator that kept the lights on. As the town's engineer, he knew this box intimately. He knew its weaknesses. He pulled a heavy, insulated screwdriver from his tool belt. He looked back toward the front. Peter was still arguing, a wall of man and dog holding back the mob. Milo took a deep breath. He jammed the screwdriver between the two main terminals. The result was instantaneous. A blinding blue-white flash exploded from the box with a deafening crack. Sparks rained down, hissing in the snow. The generator choked, sputtered, and died. In the cabin, the lights, the heater, and Luca's heart monitor instantly went dark. The sudden flash and the plunging silence made the armed men yell in alarm, spinning around. What the hell was that? "It's the generator!" In the chaos, Milo staggered out from the side of the house, clutching his arm, his face a mask of manufactured terror. He coughed, the smell of ozone sharp in his lungs. He attacked me!" Milo screamed, pointing toward the back of the cabin. "It's Luca! He's running! He attacked me, and he's running!" He stumbled and fell to his knees, as if weakened. "He went out the back! He's headed for the woods!" The lie was perfect. It was everything the mob had feared. The dangerous spy was loose, and he was capable of sabotage. Barnes was frozen, his mind racing. He looked at Peter, who was staring in stunned disbelief. He looked at the smoking junction box. He looked at Milo, who was coughing on the ground. "Hank! Jim! To the back!" Barnes roared, his authority snapping back into place. "He's making for the trees! Don't let him get away!" The mob, energized by a new clear purpose, broke and ran, their boots churning the snow as they raced around the cabin to catch the phantom escapee. Barnes gave Peter one last furious look. "This is on you," he snarled, before turning to follow his men. Peter stood on the porch, his body locked in a cold, dawning dread. Ivis let out a choked sob from the doorway. Luca, the man who was too weak to lift his own head, had just attacked Milo and escaped out the back. It was an impossible lie, and in the confusion Peter saw Milo, still on the ground, look up. For one fraction of a second, Milo's terrified eyes met his, and in that gaze, Peter saw the truth. It was not an escape. It was a betrayal. The chaos was absolute. The shouts of Barnes and his men faded as they crashed through the woods behind the cabin, chasing a ghost. Peter stood on the porch, his body locked, his mind racing, trying to process the impossible. The smoking generator, the sudden darkness, Milo's terrified, lying face. "Peter?" Ivis's voice was a thin, trembling sound from the doorway. "The cot." He turned. He ran back into the cabin. The room was dark, the only light coming from the low, dying embers in the wood stove. The electronic hum of the heart monitor was gone, replaced by a terrifying silence. The cot was empty. Peter's blood ran cold. He ran through the small kitchen. The back door, the one that led to the woodshed, was open a few inches, a slice of gray light cutting the gloom. Milo's lie had not been a diversion. It had been a confession. He had not just created a phantom. He had taken a dying man. "He took him," Peter said, his voice flat with a terrible certainty. He grabbed his heavy winter pack from the floor. He checked the rifle he kept by the door, his movements fast and automatic. "Peter, what are you doing?" Ivis was at his elbow, her face white. "He took Luca." And he took the case. He slung the pack over his shoulders. "I'm going after them." "Wait!" "The phones," Ivis said, her own mind snapping back to the emergency. "The landline, the satellite, they were working. I have to get to the clinic. We have a shortwave radio there. I can reach the hospital in Missoula, call the state police." Peter paused. She was right. He was a tracker, but she was a link to the outside world. He nodded, his face grim. "Go. Bar your door, do not engage anyone. Use the radio and wait." He gave her no time to argue. He was out the door in a second, Ghost at his heel. He did not follow the mob. He circled the house, easily picking up the two sets of tracks in the snow, moving away from the cabin. One was the deep, panicked tread of Milo. The other was a shuffling, dragging, barely human trail. The trail of Luca. At the same time, a mile back in the woods, Barnes stopped. He held up a hand. His posse of angry townsfolk stopped behind him. "Quiet," Barnes commanded. They all listened. There was nothing. Just the drip of melting snow, the caw of a raven. No crashing, no running. "He's gone," Hank said, breathing hard. "Must have made the ridge." Barnes knelt, his eyes scanning the snow. He saw their own tracks, a chaotic mess. He saw the tracks from Milo's truck. He saw Peter's old tracks. What he did not see was a third set of footprints. There was no sign of an escapee. "He never came this way," Barnes said, his voice dangerously quiet. "What?" Jim asked. "But the kid—" "The kid lied," Barnes snarled, the realization hitting him. "Milo. He lied to us. He's with him." The pieces clicked into place with the cold, hard snap of a police radio. The sickness, the desperation, The kid's strange, shifty behavior. Why would he lie? Hank asked. Because he's one of them, Barnes said. He played us. He sent us on a fool's errand. Where would they go? He didn't need an answer. He knew. Luca was sick. Ivis had said so. They needed supplies. They needed medicine. They needed a vehicle that could handle the back roads, something better than Milo's rust bucket. The clinic, Barnes said, his voice a low growl. They're going for the clinic. For the ambulance. And for her. He turned, ignoring the confused shouts of his men. Keep searching. Fire 3 shots if you find anything. He did not wait for a reply, already moving back to his truck, his long legs eating up the ground. He was alone. This was his town, his responsibility. The North Star Clinic was a small one-story building at the edge of the town, its back facing the woods. Barnes parked his truck silently 2 blocks away and approached on foot, his rifle held ready at his side. He rounded the corner of the building and saw them. Milo's truck was parked by the back entrance, its engine still ticking. Milo himself was dragging Luca through the snow. Luca was barely conscious, a dead weight, draped in a heavy parka that Peter would have recognized as Milo's. Milo had the metal case tucked under his other arm, a grim prize. "We're here, Luca," Milo panted, his voice a raw whisper. "Just a few more feet. We'll get antibiotics. We'll be safe." He reached for the clinic's back door handle. It swung open, and Barnes filled the doorway, blocking the light. "Going somewhere, son?" Milo screamed, stumbling back, pulling Luca with him. He shoved the pilot behind him, shielding him. "Get out of the way, Barnes! Leave us alone!" Barnes's eyes were not on Milo. They were locked on the metal case. "That's it, isn't it?" Barnes said, his voice cold. "That's the prize. That's what they're paying you for. Treason." "You don't understand," Milo shouted, his voice cracking with panic. He was trapped. "I understand treason," Barnes said. He stepped forward, his hand reaching, not for his rifle, but for the case. "You don't know what you're doing, son." "Give that to me." "You're in over your head." "No!" Milo screamed, clutching the case. "You're the one who doesn't understand. He's not the enemy." Milo tried to shove past Barnes to get inside the clinic. Barnes, a man twice Milo's size, grabbed him by the front of the coat. The force of the grip spun Milo around, slamming him against the wall of the clinic. Barnes had his heavy hunting shotgun slung over his right shoulder, muzzle pointing down. In the struggle, the 2 men were tangled. Milo, desperate, kicked and thrashed. Barnes tried to pin him, his arm coming up to restrain Milo's flailing. It happened in a split second of clumsy, desperate physics. As they slammed against the brick, Milo's elbow came up, striking the shotgun. The stock of the heavy weapon snagged on Barnes's own sling, twisted, and hit the wall hard. The impact was just enough. The boom of the shotgun was deafening, a cannon shot in the enclosed space. The sound echoed off the mountains and was gone. Milo and Barnes both froze, still locked in their embrace. Barnes looked down. A dark, rapidly spreading stain was blooming high on the chest of his heavy wool coat. He looked up at Milo. His expression was not anger. It was a deep, profound, and final surprise. He made a small choking sound. His grip on Milo's coat loosened. He sagged, his knees buckling, and slid down the brick wall, leaving a horrific, wet red streak in his path. He came to a rest, sitting in the snow, his rifle clattering beside him. Milo stumbled back, his hands held up,
his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "No," he whispered. "No. No, I didn't. It was an accident. It was—" He stared at his hands as if expecting to see blood on them. He was shaking so violently he could barely stand. He had killed him. He had killed Barnes. He was a murderer. At that moment, the back door of the clinic, which Barnes had been blocking, was pulled open from the inside. Ivis stood there, her face white. She had her hand on the clinic's shortwave radio transmitter, which sat on a desk just inside the door. She had beaten Barnes here. She had heard the entire struggle, the shout, and the deafening shot. Her eyes went from Milo's terrified face to the body of Barnes, slumped in the snow. "Oh, God," Ivis breathed, her hand flying to her mouth. "Milo, what did you do?" Milo's panic found a new, sharp focus. He was no longer just a kid. He was a killer. He had the case. He had the witness. He could not be caught. "Get back!" he screamed, his voice a high-pitched, unfamiliar shriek. He grabbed the semi-conscious Luca by the parka and hauled him inside, shoving past Ivis. Luca collapsed onto the linoleum floor. Milo followed, the case clutched to his chest. He kicked the door shut. "Milo, he's dead," Ivis stammered, backing away. "Shut up!" Milo yelled, his eyes wild. "The keys!" "Where are the ambulance keys?" "Milo, we have to call the police. It was Barnes." "Now!" he shrieked, slamming his fist on the desk, inches from the radio. "Give me the keys!" Ivis looked at the desperate, broken young man in front of her. This was not the quiet Milo she knew. This was someone else. Someone pushed past the breaking point, his eyes holding the wild terror of an animal. She knew in that instant that he was capable of anything. Her hand shaking, she reached for the hook on the wall and pulled down the keys, the tag labeled ambulance swinging. "Get in," Milo ordered, grabbing her arm. "You're driving." "Driving where?" "Milo, we can't just—" "Drive! To the border trail, the old logging road. Drive, or I'll... He didn't have to finish. She nodded, tears of terror streaming down her face. Milo hauled Luca into the back of the ambulance, throwing him onto the gurney. He climbed into the passenger seat, the metal case held tightly on his lap, a prize that had just cost a man's life. Ivis, her hands trembling so badly she could barely fit the key in the ignition, started the engine. The ambulance lurched, its tires spinning, and then shot out of the parking lot, leaving the town and the body of Barnes behind. Peter did not wait for the shouts of the mob to fade. He knew Milo's lie for what it was. He ran back to the cabin, grabbed his pack and his rifle, and burst out the back door, Ghost at his heels. The trail was agonizingly clear in the snow. 2 sets of tracks, not one. Milo's frantic, deep-booted prints, and a second, shuffling, dragging trail. Luca. Peter's mind was a cold, sharp void. The betrayal, the theft, the danger to the town, it all paled. They had taken Luca, a dying man, into the killing cold. He and Ghost moved fast, cutting through the woods, following the path of least resistance. The tracks led, as Peter feared, toward the town, toward the only source of medicine and transport. He moved with the practiced ground-eating lope of his army days. Ghost, a silent gray streak, flowed ahead, his nose down, pausing only to ensure Peter was following. They broke the tree line at the edge of town, emerging behind the clinic, and stopped. Peter saw him first.
Barnes, slumped against the brick wall in a sitting position, his head lolled to the side. A dark, frozen stain covered the front of his wool coat. His shotgun lay beside him in the snow. A few feet away, the back door of the clinic was wide open. And leading away from the building, churning the snow into a muddy gray slurry, were the deep, distinct tracks of the town's ambulance. Ivis. The void in Peter's mind ignited. It was not a slow burn. It was an explosion, a white-hot, consuming rage that burned away all thought. Guilt, visceral and suffocating, flooded him. He had brought this to them. He had kept the secret. He had hesitated. And now Barnes was dead, and Ivis was gone. No, he whispered, the word a raw tear in the cold air. Ghost whined, pressing against his leg, sensing the seismic shift in his master. Find them, Ghost. Peter's voice was Ghost was already moving, his nose to the tire tracks, a determined, powerful engine of muscle and instinct. Peter followed, his rifle in his hands, held at the low ready. He was no longer Peter, the hermit. He was Sergeant Peter, the tracker, the soldier. And this was not a rescue. It was a hunt. The ambulance tracks were easy to follow. They led away from town, up the old, unplowed logging road that snaked toward the Canadian border. Ivis must be driving, her terror clear in the way the vehicles skidded and slid, fighting the deep snow. The world narrowed to the hunt. The cold air burned his lungs. The sound of his own breathing was too loud. The snap of a twig under his boot sounded like a trap springing. This was the trigger. The high, thin air, the biting cold, the overwhelming white of the snow, the rhythmic, agonizing crunch of his boots, the weight of the rifle in his hands, the life of a friend on the line. He had been here before, not in Montana. In the high deserts, the frozen mountains, the God-forsaken valleys, where every window held a threat and every shadow meant death. His PTSD was not a memory. It was a shroud. It fell over him, muffling the real world, sharpening the imagined one. Ghost was his point man. He was the fire team. The anger was his fuel. The guilt was his armor. Ghost suddenly stopped, his head high, sniffing the air. Peter dropped to one knee, scanning the terrain. The ambulance was ahead, nose down in a deep snowdrift, its driver's side door hanging open. They're on foot, Peter whispered. Ghost picked up the new trail instantly. 3 sets of tracks, clumsy and desperate, heading up a steep, exposed ridge. Peter moved differently now. He was off the trail, moving through the trees, parallel to them. He was using the terrain for cover. His movements were fluid, silent, lethal. He felt a strange, cold calm settle over him. He was good at this. This he understood. The fear was gone, replaced by a terrible, singular purpose. Ghost kept looking back at him, a low, confused whine in his throat. The smell of his master had changed. It was no longer the familiar scent of wood smoke, coffee, and sad patience. It was the sharp, metallic tang of adrenaline and something else, something cold and old. On me, boy, Peter ordered, his voice clipped. They reached the top of the ridge, coming to a small clearing that overlooked a vast open bowl of snow, and Peter saw them. 300 yards out, 3 dark figures stark against the white. They were moving slowly, stumbling. One figure, Milo, was pulling the other, Ivis. Luca was a collapsed weight between them. Peter did not hesitate. He dropped to one knee, the motion fluid. He braced his rifle on a fallen log. He flipped open the scope covers. He breathed out. The world compressed to the small, clear circle of his optics. The figures swam into focus. But they were not Milo, Ivis, and Luca. The snow was not snow. It was the white, sun-scorched dust of a village street. The wind was not wind. It was the distant, thin wail of a call to prayer. The figures in the scope were dark, robed, hostiles. They had a hostage, a member of his team, dragged between them, wounded. He centered the crosshairs on the man in the lead, the man pulling the hostage, the target, the one who had betrayed them, the one who had led the ambush, the one who had... His finger slid onto the trigger. The cold metal was familiar, a comfort. He took up the slack. His breath stopped. His heart was a slow, heavy drum in his ears. He just had to squeeze. One clean shot. Ghost had been tracking, his nose buried in the snow, but he froze. He felt the sudden, absolute stillness of his master. He looked up. Peter was not moving. He was a statue. The scent coming from him was overwhelming, a chemical blast of pure, focused rage. Ghost whined, a low, anxious sound. Peter did not hear him. The world was the crosshairs. Ghost offed, a short, sharp bark of confusion. "Down, boy," Peter whispered, his voice a venomous hiss. His finger tightened. He was already calculating the bullet drop. Ghost, sensing the final, irreversible moment, acted. He shoved his cold, wet nose hard against Peter's trigger hand. The sudden, unexpected pressure made Peter's finger jerk. "Damn it!" Peter hissed, shoving the dog's head away. He reacquired his target. He steadied his breath. Ghost lunged again. This time, he did not just nudge. He shoved his entire head under Peter's arm, forcing the rifle barrel up toward the empty sky. He whined, a high-pitched, desperate sound of pure distress. The physical shock, the cold, wet nose against his skin, the cry of his dog. It shattered the illusion. The dust of the village evaporated. The wail of the call to prayer became the sigh of the wind in the pines. The figures in his scope snapped back into terrifying, heartbreaking focus. It was Milo, a terrified kid, his face streaked with tears, pulling his friend. It was Ivis, her red hair a splash of color against the snow, her body limp. It was Luca, a dying man. Peter gasped, pulling his finger off the trigger as if it were white-hot iron. He lowered the rifle, his body consumed by a violent, agonizing tremor. "Oh, God," he choked out, the words catching in his throat. "Oh, God, Ghost." He dropped his forehead to the snow, his breath coming in ragged, painful sobs. He had almost done it. He had almost killed her. He had almost shot Ivis. He had seen his friend as a hostage and her captor as the enemy, and he had been willing to take the shot. Ghost pushed against him, no longer frantic, but with a deep, concerned pressure. The dog began to lick the tears and sweat from Peter's face, his body warm, his presence absolute. Peter wrapped his arm around the dog's thick ruff, anchoring himself to the living, breathing reality of the animal. He buried his face in the dog's fur, the cold, clean scent of him filling his lungs, pushing out the phantom smell of cordite and dust. He was not a soldier. He was a man. He was not in a war. He was in Montana. And he had almost become the monster. He stayed there for a long time, the shudders racking his body, until his breathing slowed. Ghost did not move, a solid, patient anchor in the storm of his master's mind. Finally, Peter raised his head. The rage was gone, burned out, replaced by a cold, aching clarity. This was not a hunt. This was a rescue. He stood up, his legs shaking, and slung his rifle over his shoulder. He looked at Ghost, his eyes clear for the first time in hours. "Okay, boy," he said, his voice hoarse. "Okay. Let's go get her." The rage had burned out, leaving a chilling, operational calm. Peter moved with a purpose he had not felt in years. The near-fatal mistake on the ridge had shocked his system, stripping away the PTSD-fueled fury and replacing it with the cold, sharp focus of a rescuer. Ivis was alive. That was all that mattered. Ghost, sensing the change in his master, had retaken the lead. The dog was no longer a frantic anchor, but a professional tracker, his silver-gray body fluid and silent as he moved through the trees. The trail was clear, the footprints of the three fugitives, deep and clumsy in the melting snow. They had been moving for another 20 minutes when Ghost stopped. He stood at the edge of a clearing, his head high, his ears swiveling. Peter dropped to one knee beside him, his gaze sweeping the open space. Ahead, almost swallowed by the forest, was a dilapidated structure. It was an old border patrol station, abandoned since the 1980s. A single-story, flat-roofed building, its windows boarded up, its paint peeling. Ghost whined, a low, soft sound. His gaze was locked on the building. "They're in there," Peter whispered. He moved slowly, circling the clearing, keeping to the trees. His rifle was slung over his back. He had almost used it to kill his best friend. He would not make that mistake again. This would be close. As he got nearer, he heard it, a dull, rhythmic thud, a crack, and a voice. "Why won't you break?" It was Milo. His voice was a high-pitched, hysterical shriek, punctuated by the sound of rock hitting metal. Peter reached a gap where a section of the boarded-up window had rotted away. He peered inside. The room was dark, filled with the debris of decades, overturned desks, rotted papers. In the center, Milo was on his knees, his parka discarded. He was using a large, jagged rock, slamming it again and again onto the metal case. A few feet away, Ivis was tied to an old metal chair, her hands bound behind her with medical tape from her own kit. Her face was bruised, her eyes wide with terror. And, on a moldy cot in the corner, Luca lay, shivering, a pool of melted snow and filth around him. He was no longer a spy or an engineer. He was just a dying man. "Milo, stop!" Ivis pleaded, her voice hoarse. "You're making it worse." "We need to help him." "This is helping," Milo screamed, raising the rock again. "This is the poison. This is what killed Barnes. This is what killed all of them. It has to be destroyed." He brought the rock down. Crack! The case was dented, scarred, but it would not open. Peter stepped back from the window. He was alone, against a desperate, panicked man who had already caused one death. He looked at Ghost. The dog was vibrating with tension, his eyes locked on the building, waiting for the command. Peter unslung his pack and pulled out a set of heavy-duty zip ties. He put them in his pocket. He was not a soldier anymore. He was a peacekeeper. He moved to the front door, which was hanging by one hinge. He stepped into the frame. "Milo." His voice was quiet, but it cut through the room like a razor. Milo froze, the rock held high above his head. He spun around, his eyes wild and bloodshot. "You," he spat. "You stayed. You followed me." "It's over, Milo," Peter said, holding his hands up slowly, showing they were empty. "Let her go. Let me help Luca. We can just stop." "Stop," Milo laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "He's dead. Barnes is dead. Because of this. Because of you. You kept it. You made me." "You made your choice, Milo," Peter said, his voice hard. "Now make the right one. Untie her." Milo's eyes darted from Peter to Ivis. He saw his leverage. He dropped the rock and scrambled to Ivis, pulling a scalpel from his pocket, taken from the ambulance. He pressed the flat of the blade against her throat. "You stay back," he shrieked. "You stay back or I'll cut her. I swear I will." Ivis let out a choked sob, squeezing her eyes shut. Peter's vision narrowed. The calm was shattered. The PTSD, the cold rage, it was still there, just beneath the surface, waiting. He saw the blade. He saw her terror. He glanced at the broken side window. Ghost was there, a gray shadow, his paws on the sill, waiting. Peter locked eyes with Milo. "You don't want to do that. Try me. Get out. Get out and let us go." Peter took one slow breath. He gave a short, sharp nod to the window. "Ghost, go." The command was flat, almost conversational. The sound that followed was an explosion. Ghost did not just climb through the window, he crashed through it, a 90-pound missile of silver-gray fur and fury, shattering the rotted wood and glass. Milo shrieked in terror as the dog hit him, a split second after he saw the movement. The impact was brutal. Man and dog went down in a chaotic tumble, crashing over an old desk. The metal case, which Milo had been standing over, was kicked hard. It flew across the room, slamming against the far wall. The impact sprung a damaged latch. The case popped open, and from the foam padding inside, a single, tiny black object. A small data card, no bigger than a thumbnail, was ejected. It flew through the air, unseen in the chaos, and skittered across the dusty floorboards, disappearing into a dark, narrow crack between two planks. No one saw it. Peter was already moving. Milo, screaming, was trying to fight the dog. Ghost had his jaws locked on Milo's arm, the arm holding the scalpel, shaking his head with controlled, punishing force. The blade clattered to the floor. "Get him off!" Milo screamed. Peter was on him. He grabbed Milo by the collar, pulling him off the dog. He threw the younger man onto his back, his knee pinning Milo's chest. "Ghost, off!" Peter commanded. The dog instantly released his grip, his breathing harsh, saliva dripping from his jowls. He stood over Ivis, a panting, protective guard. Peter's hands were on Milo. The fight was over. He had won. But as he looked down at the terrified, weeping young man, he did not see Milo. He saw the enemy. He saw the face of the man who had led his team into an ambush, the man who had taken his friend, the man who had caused all this death. The blood was roaring in his ears. The cold, operational calm vanished, replaced by the white-hot singular rage he had held back on the ridge. His hands, of their own accord, moved from Milo's chest to his throat. "You killed him," Peter whispered, his voice a low, terrifying growl. "You took her. You.
His grip tightened. Milo clawed at Peter's hands, his eyes bulging. He made a choked, gargling sound. Peter was gone. He was back in the dust, the adrenaline singing, his duty clear. End the threat. "Peter!" A scream. "Peter, no! Stop! You're killing him!"
It was Ivis, her voice. It cut through the red haze. Peter's hands did not loosen. "Peter!" A sharp, piercing, frantic bark. Bark! Bark! Ghost! Peter blinked. The roar in his ears faded. He looked down. He saw his own hands, his knuckles white, buried in the soft flesh of Milo's throat. He saw the young man's face, purple and contorted in a silent scream. He was doing it. He was killing him. He recoiled, throwing himself backward as if he had been burned. He scrambled away, gasping, staring at his own hands in horror. Quote. Milo lay on the floor, his body convulsing, taking in a massive, ragged, whooping breath. "It's over, Peter," Ivis said, her voice soft now, tears streaming down her face. "It's over. You have him." Peter stared at her, his chest heaving. He had almost done it again. Ghost pushed his head under Peter's trembling hand, grounding him. The sound of rotors, distant but growing, filled the air. Whump, whump, whump. A helicopter. And then the sound of heavy vehicles. Peter looked at Ivis. "The radio." I hit the panic button," Ivis whispered. "The emergency beacon, before he grabbed me. I must have hit it." Peter nodded, the last of the adrenaline draining away, leaving him empty. He pulled the zip ties from his pocket. He walked over to Milo, who was now just a sobbing, broken young man. Peter pulled Milo's hands behind his back and secured them, his movements mechanical. The doors of the station burst open, flooding the room with light. Men in dark green uniforms carrying rifles fanned out. Border Patrol. "Hands up! Hands up now!" Peter slowly raised his hands. He looked at the armed men, at his captive, at his friend, and at the dog who had, once again, saved his soul. "It's okay," Peter said, not to the soldiers but to Ivis. "Help is here." The world rushed in, loud and official. The Border Patrol agents were efficient, their green uniforms a stark professional contrast to the chaos. They moved with a practiced, impersonal calm that Peter found both jarring and comforting. Ivis, wrapped in a shock blanket, was already giving her statement. Her voice was thin but steady, recounting the events with a nurse's precision. Medics who had arrived with the BP team were working on Luca. He was still breathing, just barely. They had him stabilized and were preparing him for airlift. Peter watched as they loaded the gurney onto the helicopter that had landed in the snowy bowl outside, its rotors kicking up a blinding storm. Milo, his hands secured behind him, was sitting on the floor, his face blank. The hysterical terror had been replaced by a hollow, empty shock. He did not look at Peter or Ivis as the agents pulled him to his feet and led him away. Peter stood in the corner of the room, his hand resting on Ghost's head. The dog was a warm, solid presence, the only thing that felt real. An agent had already taken his rifle and his brief tactical statement. He was no longer a person of interest, just a witness, a survivor. "Sir," an agent said to him, his voice polite, "you're free to go. We'll have an officer escort you and Miss Ivis back to town." Peter just nodded. He and Ivis sat in the back of the warm patrol vehicle, the silence between them heavy. Ghost sat at their feet, his head on Peter's knee. The town of North Star was reeling. The news of Barnes's death, a tragic accident during a heroic act, was the official story. The news of Milo's arrest for kidnapping and the presence of a foreign national was the story that was whispered. The town was quiet, the anger from the mob replaced by a stunned, confused grief. 3 days passed. The plows finally came, clearing the pass. The world was connected again. Peter was at his cabin, nailing a new sheet of plywood over the shattered side window of the old border station. Ivis was with him. Ghost was sniffing the perimeter, his presence a quiet comfort. "I can't believe I left it," Ivis said, her voice muffled by her scarf. She was searching the dusty floor inside. "My grandmother gave it to me." "We'll find it," Peter said. Their official reason for being there was to retrieve her locket, a small silver oval torn from her neck in the struggle with Milo. But Peter knew they were both there for another reason. They were there to face the ghosts, to reclaim the space from the horror it now held. Ivis was searching near the chair where she had been tied. Peter was looking near the wall where the case had broken open. He scanned the floor, his eyes tracing the path of the debris. He saw it. It was not the locket. It was a small, dark glint, almost invisible, wedged deep in a crack between two floorboards, a tiny black square. The data card. He knelt, his back to Ivis. His fingers were too thick to get it. He pulled his multi-tool from his pocket and used the pliers to carefully, gently extract it. He palmed it, the tiny object feeling heavy in his hand. "Found it," Ivis called out, a note of triumph in her voice. She was holding the silver locket, its chain broken. Peter stood, closing his fist around the card. "Good," he said, his voice even. "Let's go home." 2 weeks later, the snow was beginning to melt in the valley, exposing the brown, muddy earth. Peter's cabin was quiet. He was sitting at his workbench in the woodshed, an old offline laptop in front of him. A complex series of adapters and card readers were plugged into its side. He had spent days using his old Army signals intelligence skills to bypass the encryption. He clicked Run. The screen flickered, and a file directory opened. He did not open it. He unplugged the card, took the laptop into the main cabin, and set it on the table. He had called Ivis. She sat across from him, a mug of tea steaming in her hands. Ghost lay at their feet, his head on his paws, watching them both. "You found it, didn't you?" she said. It was not a question. Peter nodded. "I did." "Do we want to know, Peter?" she asked, her voice quiet. "Barnes is gone. Milo is in federal custody. Luca, they say he's stable, but he's been transferred and no one will say where." "It's over." "Is it?" Peter asked. He looked at her. "I need to know. I need to know what I almost killed Milo for, and what Barnes died for." He turned the laptop and plugged the card in. He opened the first file. It was not military. There were no battle plans, no launch codes. It was a corporate logo. A company called Eterna Bioresearch. Peter knew the name. They had a large, heavily secured compound deep in the next valley, a place that claimed to do agricultural research. "What is this?" Ivis asked, leaning in. Peter clicked through the files. His blood ran cold. They were test results, air dispersal patterns, infection vectors, data from animal trials. It was clinical, sterile, and horrifying. "It's not a military weapon," Peter said, his voice a raw whisper. "It's a biological one. A virus." They were testing it. He found another file, a flight log. It was Luca's. And a second log for a drone. He cross-referenced the times. They weren't shooting him down, Peter said, pointing to the screen. They were herding him, trying to force him down inside their own territory. But the storm hit and he crashed here instead. He found the last file, a security report. Luca, an engineer, had discovered what they were doing. He had stolen the data. He was a whistleblower. The colleagues, he feared, were not a foreign army. They were corporate security. Ivis sat back, her face pale. My God, the town, the livestock, the water. They're testing this here. A deep, cold silence filled the room. This truth was far uglier than a simple spy story. This was not about nations. It was about greed. What do we do? Ivis asked. We give it to the police? The feds? Peter thought of the feds who had quietly made Luca disappear. He thought of the local sheriff who had so quickly accepted the official story of Barnes's death. He thought of the money Eterna pumped into the local economy. No, Peter said, they'll bury it. They'll classify it. It will disappear, just like Luca. He shut the laptop. He knew what he had to do. 3 days later, Peter's truck pulled into a parking spot in Missoula, 2 hours away from North Star. Ghost sat in the passenger seat watching the city traffic. Peter got out, holding a thick 9-by-12-inch manila envelope. It had no return address. It was addressed to the lead investigative journalist at the Washington Post, a name he had gotten from one of Ivis's old college friends. Inside was a hard copy printout of the most critical data, a new, clean USB drive containing all the files, and a single typed, anonymous note. Check the water in the Bitterroot Valley. They are poisoning you. This is the proof. He walked to the blue collection box on the street corner. He held the envelope over the slot, pausing for 1 second. This was it. There was no going back. He let it go. It dropped with a heavy, final thud. He walked back to his truck and got in, the cab warm and familiar. He sat there for a long moment, the noise of the city seeming very far away. Ghost, sensing the tension had passed, leaned over the center console and licked his hand. Peter smiled, a real tired smile. He put his hand on the dog's thick ruff, his fingers scratching the familiar spot behind his ears. The dog who had pulled him from the nightmares on the ridge. The dog who had stopped his hands at the border station. The dog who had been his anchor. His conscience. He put the truck in gear and pulled out into traffic. He had come to the mountains seeking an end to his war. He had failed. But as he drove, he realized he had not been running from a fight. He had just been waiting for the right one. He was not a soldier anymore, not in the way he had been. But he was still a protector. He had found a new way to fight, not with a rifle, but with the truth. And for the first time since he had come home, Peter felt a quiet, unfamiliar sense of peace. Sometimes the deepest wounds are the ones we cannot see, and often the best medicine is a quiet, unwavering love, a loyalty that asks for nothing but gives everything. Just like the bond between Peter and Ghost. These connections are what inspire all of our tales. If their journey touched your heart, we hope you'll join our community by subscribing. Your support through likes and shares helps these stories find the people who need them. We would be honored to read your own reflections in the comments below. Our newest story is waiting for you now, right on the screen.